The rain was coming down hard that October evening, turning the busy downtown streets into rivers of gray water. Daniel pulled his thin jacket tighter around his body, but it didn't help much. The cold had already seeped through to his bones. He'd been walking for hours, trying to stay warm, trying to ignore the aching emptiness in his stomach. 3 days. That's how long it had been since he'd eaten a real meal. Not just a handful of crackers from a convenience store or half a sandwich someone had thrown away. A real meal with hot food that actually filled you up and made you feel human again. Daniel stopped in front of a fancy Italian restaurant called Romano's. The warm lights spilling out onto the wet sidewalk looked like something from another world. Through the large windows, he could see families laughing together, couples holding hands across white tablecloths, waiters carrying plates piled high with pasta and bread, and things that smelled so good it made his chest hurt. He was 16 years old. Just 16. 2 weeks ago, the foster home had told him it was time to leave. Something about budget cuts and age limits. They'd given him a garbage bag with his clothes and pointed him toward the door. The youth shelter downtown was full every night, with a waiting list that stretched for weeks. So Daniel had been sleeping in doorways, under bridges, anywhere he could find that kept him out of sight. The only thing he had left from his old life was tucked under his arm in a beat-up black case. His violin. The case was held together with duct tape, and the handle had broken off months ago. But inside was something precious, something his grandmother had given him before she died. Back when he still had a family, back when things made sense. Daniel had learned to play when he was 4 years old. His parents had enrolled him at the Meadowbrook Conservatory. It's one of those fancy music schools where kids practiced for hours every day. He'd loved it. The violin had been his best friend, his escape, his voice when he couldn't find the words to speak. Then everything changed when he was 12. A car accident took both his parents in a single terrible moment, and Daniel's whole world came crashing down. The foster system didn't care about violin lessons. They didn't care that he'd once performed in concerts or won competitions. They just moved him from house to house, and the violin stayed in its case more and more. But he never sold it, even when he was desperate. Some things you just can't let go of. Now, standing outside Romano's, with rain dripping down his face, Daniel made a decision. He was tired of being invisible. Tired of feeling worthless. He had a skill, something he was actually good at, and maybe, just maybe, someone would give him a chance. He walked up to the entrance where a large man in a fancy suit stood under an awning. The man had slicked back hair and a name tag that said Gerald Motter. He was checking names off a list and greeting customers with a big fake smile that never quite reached his eyes. Daniel took a deep breath and approached him. His voice came out smaller than he wanted, barely louder than a whisper. "Excuse me, sir. I know this might sound strange, but I can play violin really well. Would it be okay if I performed inside for just a little while? I don't need money. Just maybe something to eat. Anything at all?" Gerald looked up from his list. His eyes traveled slowly from Daniel's worn-out sneakers with holes in the toes, up his thin frame and oversized jacket, to his wet hair plastered against his forehead. The man's expression changed from professional politeness to something cold and mean. Then Gerald laughed. Not a small chuckle, but a loud, booming laugh that made several customers turn their heads. "You," Gerald said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You want to perform here? Kid, look at yourself. This is a 5-star restaurant. We have standards. We're not running some kind of charity kitchen or street carnival." A couple in expensive coats had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The woman whispered something to her husband, and they both smirked before walking past Daniel into the warm restaurant. Daniel felt his face burning despite the cold rain. "I'm actually really good," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I trained at a conservatory. I just need a chance to show you a conservatory." Gerald interrupted with another harsh laugh. "Sure you did, kid. And I'm secretly a prince. Look, you need to move along. You're making our guests uncomfortable." 2 waiters had come to stand beside Gerald now. One of them, a younger guy with gelled hair, shook his head and muttered something about these people always trying to scam their way into free food. The other one crossed his arms and stared Daniel down like he was some kind of criminal. Daniel's hands tightened around his violin case. He wanted to yell at them, to tell them they were wrong, that he wasn't trying to scam anyone. He wanted to prove right there on the sidewalk that he could play better than any musician they'd ever heard. But the words stuck in his throat and his eyes started to sting with tears he absolutely refused to let fall. "I'm sorry for bothering you," Daniel finally said, his voice cracking slightly. He turned to walk away, pulling his violin case close to his chest like it was the only friend he had left in the world. Because right then, it was. He made it about 10 steps before he had to stop and lean against a brick wall. The hunger was bad, but it was the humiliation that really hurt. The way they'd looked at him like he was nothing, like he didn't matter at all. Like everything he'd ever worked for and everything he'd lost meant absolutely nothing because he was wearing old clothes. And asking for help? Daniel closed his eyes and tried to remember what his mom used to tell him when he was nervous before performances. "Your music speaks for itself," she'd say, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You don't need fancy clothes or a big stage. When you play, people will listen." But nobody wanted to listen now. Nobody wanted to give him that chance. The rain was getting heavier, and Daniel knew he needed to find somewhere dry to spend the night. Maybe the bus station would let him sit in the waiting area for a while. Maybe he could play there for spare change. Though security usually kicks street performers out pretty quickly, he pushed away from the wall and started walking again, his stomach growling loud enough that he could hear it over the sound of rain and traffic. Tomorrow, he'd try somewhere else. Some other restaurant, some other chance. He had to keep trying because giving up meant something even worse than hunger. It meant letting them win. It meant believing what Gerald's laugh had said about him, that he was worthless, that his talent didn't matter, that he deserved to be invisible. Daniel didn't know it yet, but someone had been watching the entire scene from just a few feet away. Someone who understood that the worn-out case he carried might hold something extraordinary. Someone who knew that real talent doesn't care about appearances, and that sometimes the most remarkable gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. His life was about to change. But first, he had to make it through the crushing weight of this moment. This rejection, this cold October rain that seemed like it would never stop falling. Dr. Helen Morrison had seen a lot in her 63 years of life, but she never got used to cruelty, especially not the casual kind, the type that people inflicted on others without even thinking about it. She'd been standing outside, Romano's taking a phone call from her daughter, when she noticed the teenage boy approaching the entrance. Something about the way he carried himself caught her attention. Despite his ragged appearance, there was a carefulness to his movements, a gentle way he held that battered violin case that spoke of respect and love. For whatever was inside, Helen had been teaching music at the city's top university for over 30 years. She'd worked with hundreds of students, some talented, some not so much. But she'd developed an instinct over the years, a sixth sense for recognizing when someone had that special something. And watching this boy, even from a distance, that instinct was tingling. Then she heard Gerald's laugh. Loud, cruel, designed to humiliate. She watched the whole scene unfold, saw the boy's shoulders slump, saw the waiters join in with their smirks and judgmental looks. It made her blood boil. Helen ended her phone call mid-sentence and walked toward the boy just as he was turning to leave. She could see him fighting back tears, could see the way his hands trembled as he clutched his violin case. "Young man." "Wait just a moment, please," she called out, her voice firm but kind. Daniel turned around slowly, his eyes wary. He'd learned not to trust adults too easily. Most of them just disappointed you in the end. Helen smiled at him, and it was a real smile, warm and genuine. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing an elegant coat that probably cost more than everything Daniel owned. But her eyes were different from the people who'd just laughed at him. They were kind. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop," Helen said, walking closer. "But I heard what you asked, and I heard how they responded. I'd like to make you an offer, if you're willing to hear it." Daniel didn't say anything. just stood there in the rain, waiting for whatever came next. "I'd like to hear you play," Helen continued. "If you're as good as you say you are, I'll buy you a proper dinner. Not leftovers, not scraps. A real meal, whatever you want. And if you're exceptional, well, I might be able to help you with something more than just food." Behind them, Gerald had noticed the interaction and came hurrying over. "Dr. Morrison, I really must insist this is inappropriate. We can't have vagrants loitering around our establishment. It's bad for business." Helen turned to face him, and her expression could have frozen fire. "Gerald, I've been a customer at this restaurant for 15 years. I've spent thousands of dollars here. I've brought colleagues, family, important guests. Are you really going to tell me who I can and cannot speak to on a public sidewalk?" Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again. He knew exactly who Dr. Helen Morrison was. Everyone in the city's cultural circle knew her. She had connections, influence, and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. "I thought not," Helen said crisply. "Now, there's a small plaza just across the street. We'll go there, and this young man will play for me. You can return to your duties." Daniel followed Helen across the street, barely believing what was happening. The plaza was one of those small urban spaces with a few benches and some trees, now mostly empty because of the rain. A few people hurried past with umbrellas, not paying attention to anything except getting where they needed to go. "What's your name, son?" Helen asked as they reached the center of the plaza. "Daniel," he said quietly. "Daniel Park." "Well, Daniel Park, I'm Helen Morrison. I teach music at the university. I've been doing it for a very long time, which means I've heard a lot of violin players. Some good, some terrible, most somewhere in between. I'm going to be honest with you about what I hear. Is that all right?" Daniel nodded. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was it. This was his chance to prove he wasn't just some nobody begging for scraps. He knelt down and opened his violin case. Even in the dim streetlight, Helen could see the quality of the instrument inside. Her eyebrows rose slightly. That was no cheap student violin. The wood had a deep, rich color, and the craftsmanship was clearly exceptional. "That's a beautiful instrument," Helen said softly. "May I ask where you got it?" "My grandmother," Daniel replied, carefully lifting the violin out. "She gave it to me before she died. Said it was in her family for generations." He picked up his bow and applied rosin with practiced, careful movements. His hands had stopped shaking. This was familiar territory. The violin felt like coming home. "What are you going to play?" Helen asked. Daniel thought for a moment. He could play something safe, something easy, that would guarantee he didn't mess up. But something in Helen's eyes told him she would know the difference. She would know if he was holding back. "Paganini," he said. "Caprice, number 24. Helen's eyes widened. That piece was notoriously difficult, one of the most technically demanding works ever written for violin. Professional musicians spent years mastering it. If this boy was bluffing, she'd know within the first few notes. "That's quite ambitious," she said. "Whenever you're ready." Daniel raised the violin to his shoulder and closed his eyes. For just a second, he let himself remember everything. His mother driving him to lessons every Tuesday and Thursday. His father recording his recitals on an old camcorder, beaming with pride. His grandmother's wrinkled hands showing. Him how to hold the bow properly when he was barely tall enough to reach the strings. Then he began to play. The first. Notes cut through the sound. Of rain and traffic, like a knife through silk. Clean, precise, perfect. Helen felt the hair on her arms stand up. Daniel's fingers moved across the fingerboard with impossible speed and accuracy. The difficult double stops, the rapid string crossings, the flying staccato passage, he executed them all flawlessly. But it wasn't just the technical skill that made Helen's breath catch in her throat. It was the emotion. Every note carried weight. You could hear the hunger in the music, the loneliness, the rejection. But you could also hear something else. Hope, defiance, a refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. Daniel was pouring his entire life story into this piece, and it was absolutely stunning. People started to stop. First one person, then 2, then 5. A woman with shopping bags stood frozen on the sidewalk. A businessman in a suit paused with his phone halfway to his ear. A young couple with umbrellas moved closer, their faces filled with wonder. Within 3 minutes, a crowd of about 30 people had gathered around the plaza. Some of them were getting soaked by the rain, but nobody seemed to care. They were transfixed. Daniel didn't notice any of it. He was lost in the music. In that place where nothing else existed, except the sound and the feeling and the absolute freedom of expression. His eyes were still closed, and tears were streaming down his face. Mixing with the rain, the piece built toward its climactic ending, the notes climbing higher and higher, faster and faster. Daniel's bow flew across the strings in a blur of motion. And then, with one final triumphant note, it was over. For 3 heartbeats, there was complete silence. Then the crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the plaza, echoing off the buildings. People were cheering, whistling, shouting words of amazement. Several people had their phones out. Daniel would later learn they'd been recording the whole thing. Helen was clapping too. Tears were running down her face. In 30 years of teaching, she'd rarely heard anything so extraordinary. This wasn't just talent. This was genius. Raw. Untrained genius that had somehow survived years of hardship and neglect. Daniel opened his eyes and lowered his violin, looking dazed and confused by the crowd's reaction. People were rushing forward, trying to hand him money, asking questions all at once. It was overwhelming. Helen stepped in quickly, putting a gentle hand on his shoulder and guiding him to a nearby bench. Someone handed her a coat, and she wrapped it around Daniel's shaking shoulders. "Easy now," she said softly. "Just breathe. You're all right. Was it okay?" Daniel asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I know I made a few mistakes in the middle section," Helen laughed, but it was a laugh of pure joy. "Mistakes?" "Daniel, I've been teaching music for 3 decades. I've worked with students from all over the world, some of them considered prodigies. What you just did. That was one of the finest performances I've ever witnessed." Daniel stared at her like he didn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Where did you train?" Helen asked. "Who's your current teacher?" And so Daniel told her everything. About the conservatory, about his parents, about the foster homes and the shelters and the 2 weeks he'd spent on the streets. Helen listened to every word, her expression growing more horrified and more determined with each detail. Around them, the crowd was still buzzing with excitement. Someone shouted that they'd already posted the video online. Another person was calling a friend who worked at a news station. The moment was taking on a life of its own, but Helen was focused entirely on the exhausted, talented, heartbroken boy sitting next to her. She was already making plans, already thinking about phone calls she needed to make, people she needed to contact. "Daniel," she said firmly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your life is about to change. I'm going to make sure of it." Daniel woke up the next morning in a bed. An actual bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket and a pillow that didn't smell like the streets. For a confused moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then everything from the night before came rushing back. Helen had taken him to her home. Not to a shelter, not to some institutional building, but to her actual house where she lived with her husband. They'd fed him soup and bread, then pasta, then more bread because he couldn't stop eating. Her husband Robert, a gentle man with kind eyes and graying hair, had quietly set out fresh towels and shown Daniel to their guest room without making him feel like a charity case. Now, lying in that comfortable bed, Daniel could hear voices downstairs. He got up slowly, his body still aching from weeks of sleeping on concrete and park benches. Someone had washed his clothes overnight, and they were folded neatly on a chair. Even his shoes had been cleaned when he came down to the kitchen. Helen was on her phone, pacing back and forth with an energy that seemed almost frantic. Robert was making breakfast, and he smiled when he saw Daniel. "Scrambled eggs okay?" Robert asked. Daniel nodded, not quite trusting his voice yet. Everything felt surreal. Helen ended her call and turned to face him. Her expression was hard to read, somewhere between excited and concerned. "Daniel, I need to show you something," she said, gesturing for him to sit at the kitchen table. She placed her laptop in front of him and pressed play on a video. It was him, playing in the rain last night. The camera angle was shaky, clearly shot on someone's phone, but the audio was surprisingly clear. You could hear every note, every emotion. You could see the crowd gathering, see the looks of amazement on people's faces. The video had a caption, "Homeless teen humiliated by fancy restaurant." Then reveals he's a musical genius. "How many views does it have?" Daniel asked quietly. "When I first saw it at 6 this morning, it had about 50,000, Helen said, sitting down beside him. Now, 3 hours later, it's at 2.3 million. Daniel's hand froze halfway to the coffee cup Robert had just placed in front of him. "Million?" "It's gone viral," Helen explained. "Completely viral. It's on the news, it's being shared across every social media platform, and my phone hasn't stopped ringing since dawn. News stations want interviews. Music schools are calling. People are offering donations, scholarships, help of all kinds." She paused, watching his face carefully. "Daniel, I need to know if you're okay with this. Because once we open this door, your life is going to change dramatically. You won't be invisible anymore." Daniel thought about Gerald's laugh. He thought about all the people who'd looked right through him on the streets like he didn't exist. He thought about every foster parent who'd told him music was a waste of time, that he needed to focus on something practical. "I'm okay with it," he said firmly. What happened over the next few days was like a whirlwind. Helen had connections everywhere in the music world, and she used every single one of them. The dean of the university's music program came to the house personally to hear Daniel play. He offered a full scholarship on the spot, including room and board. With tears in his eyes, a famous violin maker from 3 states away saw the video and recognized the instrument Daniel was playing. He called Helen directly, explaining that it was a 19th century Italian violin worth at least $80,000, possibly more. He offered to restore it to perfect condition at no charge, saying it would be an honor to work on an instrument played with such soul. The media attention grew bigger every day. The video had been viewed over 10 million times now. People from around the world were commenting, sharing their own stories of being judged by their appearance, having their talents dismissed. But it was the negative attention that nobody had expected. Romano's restaurant was in serious trouble. Protesters had gathered outside with signs that said things like "Music has no dress code" and "Talent deserves respect." Online reviews were flooding in, all of them 1-star ratings. People were sharing their own stories of being mistreated by the staff. The restaurant's owner, Vincent Romano, reached out through Helen asking for a meeting with Daniel. Helen was protective, but Daniel surprised her by agreeing to it. They met at a small coffee shop, neutral territory. Vincent was a man in his 50s with tired eyes and hands that wouldn't stop fidgeting. Gerald the Mater D wasn't with him. Daniel would later learn he'd been fired the day after the video went viral. "I don't expect you to forgive what happened," Vincent started, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "What Gerald did, what my staff did, it was wrong. Completely wrong. I've spent the last week trying to figure out how I let my restaurant become a place where that kind of behavior was acceptable." Daniel listened quietly, his hands wrapped around a hot chocolate Helen had insisted on buying him. "I've owned Romano's for 22 years, Vincent continued. My father opened it 30 years before that. It was supposed to be about bringing people together through food, creating moments of joy. Somewhere along the way, it became about status and exclusivity and all the wrong things." He pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. "This isn't to make things right. Nothing can do that. But I want to donate $25,000 to any charity or cause you choose. And I want to start a program at the restaurant where young musicians can perform once a week, with a full meal provided whether anyone tips them or not." Daniel stared at the envelope, not touching it. "Why are you really doing this? Is it just to save your business?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, at first, yes. I was panicking about the protests and the reviews and the money we were losing. But then I watched that video, really watched it. I saw your face when Gerald laughed at you, and I saw my own son in you." His voice cracked slightly. "My son wanted to be a dancer. I told him it was a waste of time, that he needed to focus on taking over the family business. We fought about it for years." He doesn't talk to me anymore. He's 32 years old. I haven't seen him in 5 years because I couldn't accept that his dream was different from mine. Vincent wiped his eyes quickly. You don't owe me anything, Daniel. But I'm asking for the chance to do better. To be better. Daniel looked at Helen, who gave him a small nod. The decision was his to make. I'll accept the donation, Daniel said slowly, but it goes to starting a foundation. Something that helps kids aging out of foster care who have talents in music or art or anything creative. They need support, mentorship, housing. Nobody should have to choose between their gift and survival. Done, Vincent said immediately. And I'll add another $25,000 to get it started properly. The story of their meeting made headlines too. People were moved by the forgiveness, by the second chance, by the idea that one moment of cruelty could lead to positive change if people were willing to learn from it. Meanwhile, Daniel was adjusting to his new life. Living with Helen and Robert, he had structure and safety for the first time in years. He practiced for hours a day, working with Helen and other instructors she brought in. They were preparing him for something big, though they wouldn't tell him exactly what yet. The foundation was taking shape too. A wealthy couple who'd lost their daughter in an accident had seen Daniel's story and wanted to help. They provided funding and helped with the legal work to get everything established properly. They named it Second String Foundation, and Daniel loved that. It meant second chances. But it also referenced the violin strings that had saved his life. Letters poured in from young people all over the country. Kids in foster care, homeless teens, young artists who'd been told their dreams didn't matter. They shared their stories, and Daniel read every single one. Helen would sometimes find him at the kitchen table late at night, writing responses by hand to as many as he could. You don't have to answer them all personally, she told him gently one evening. Yes, I do, Daniel said. Someone believed in me when nobody else would. These kids need to know someone believes in them too. 6 weeks after that rainy night outside Romano's, Helen sat Daniel down for a serious conversation. There's an opportunity, she said carefully. A very big opportunity. But I need you to understand it comes with a lot of pressure. Daniel asked. Carnegie Hall in New York City. They're hosting a benefit concert for homeless youth. They want you to be the featured soloist with a major symphony orchestra. It would be broadcast on television, streamed online. Millions of people would watch. Daniel's heart started racing. Carnegie Hall. Every serious musician dreamed of performing there. When he managed to ask. 3 months from now, Helen said, which means we have a lot of work to do. Are you ready for this? Daniel thought about the boy who'd stood in the rain begging for a chance. He thought about every kid out there right now who felt invisible, who had gifts the world wasn't seeing. He thought about his parents and how proud they would have been. I'm ready, he said, and for the first time in years, Daniel truly believed it. The morning Daniel moved into the university dormitory, he stood in the doorway of his new room and just stared. It was small, just a basic dorm room with a bed, a desk, and a tiny closet. But it was his. Actually his. With a key that had his name on it and everything, his roommate was a jazz piano student named Chris, who greeted him with an easy smile and didn't ask questions about where Daniel had come from or why he didn't have much stuff. Within a week, they were good friends, staying up late talking about music theory and arguing about which composers were overrated. But the real work was happening in the practice rooms. Helen had put together a team of instructors to prepare Daniel for Carnegie Hall, and they didn't go easy on him. There was Professor Way, a stern woman in her 70s who'd played with orchestras around the world and had impossibly high standards. There was Anton, a bow technique specialist who made Daniel repeat the same passage 40 times until his arm felt like it might fall off. And there was Helen herself, who worked with him on interpretation and emotional expression. Technical perfection is important, Helen told him during one session, but it's not enough. Anyone can learn to play the notes correctly with enough practice. What separates a good musician from a great one is the ability to make people feel something. You already have that gift. Now we're just refining it. The piece they'd chosen for Carnegie Hall was Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D major. It was a massive work. Nearly 40 minutes long, that would require Daniel to perform with a full symphony orchestra. He'd never played with an orchestra before, never had to coordinate with dozens of other musicians while staying perfectly in sync with a conductor. Some days, the preparation felt impossible. Daniel would practice for hours until his fingers ached and his shoulder burned from holding the violin. He'd make a mistake and have to start over, then make the same mistake again. There were moments when the old doubts crept in, whispering that he wasn't good enough, that he'd gotten lucky with that one viral performance but couldn't sustain it. On one particularly difficult day, Daniel threw his bow down in frustration and walked out of the practice room. He found himself sitting on a bench outside the music building, his head in his hands. Professor Wei found him there 20 minutes later. She sat down beside him without saying anything for a while, just watching the students walk by between classes. "You know what I see when I look at you?" she finally said. Daniel shook his head. "I see someone who survived things that would have broken most people. You lost your parents. You lived in foster care. You spent time on the streets. And through all of that, you held on to your music. Do you know how rare that is? How much strength that takes?" "It doesn't feel like strength," Daniel said quietly. "It feels like I barely made it. Like I'm still barely making it." Professor Wei nodded. "Good. That means you're human. The moment you think you have it all figured out is the moment you stop growing." She stood up and brushed off her skirt. "Now get back in there. We have 3 measures in the second movement that still need work." The foundation was growing too faster than anyone had expected. Vincent from Romano's had kept his promise, and with the initial funding, they'd been able to help 12 young people in just the first 2 months. Kids who were aging out of foster care and had talents in art, dance, music, writing. The foundation provided them with housing stipends, connected them with mentors, and helped them pursue their passions. While also getting practical life skills training, Daniel tried to meet with as many of them as he could. There was Tyler, a 17-year-old poet who'd been living in his car and writing on napkins from fast food restaurants. There was Keisha, a painter whose foster parents had thrown away her art supplies, saying they were a waste of money. There was Raj, a dancer who'd hidden his talent for years because the group home he'd lived in had made fun of him for it. Each of their stories reminded Daniel of why the Carnegie Hall concert mattered so much. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing the world that talent exists everywhere, in people from all backgrounds, and that everyone deserves a chance to develop their gifts. But as the concert date got closer, the pressure intensified. Media requests were constant. A major news magazine wanted to do a cover story. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow Daniel around for a week. Talk shows were calling with interview requests. Helen helped him navigate it all. It's teaching him how to handle interviews, when to say yes, and when to politely decline. "You need to protect your energy," she told him. "The performance is what matters most. Everything else is secondary." 2 weeks before the concert, Daniel's restored violin arrived back from the maker. Opening that case felt like Christmas morning. The instrument gleamed, every scratch and worn spot carefully repaired. The maker had included a long letter explaining the work he'd done and the violin's history. It had been crafted in 1887 by a master maker in Naples, and it had been played by several notable musicians over the decades before ending up in Daniel's grandmother's family. "It's been waiting for you," Helen said, watching Daniel's face as he lifted the violin, "waiting for someone who would love it and honor it the way you do." The first rehearsal with the full orchestra was terrifying. Daniel stood on the stage of a concert hall, facing dozens of professional musicians who'd been playing their instruments longer than he'd been alive. The conductor, a woman named Maestro Chen, was famous for being brilliant but demanding. "Let's start from the beginning," she said crisply, raising her baton. "Don't worry about perfection. Just play." The orchestra launched into the opening tutti, the sound washing over Daniel like a wave. When his entrance came, he raised his violin and began to play. For the first few measures, he was conscious of every eye on him, every ear listening. Then the music took over, and suddenly he wasn't alone on that stage. He was part of something bigger, his melody weaving through and around the orchestra's harmonies. When they finished the first movement, Maestro Chen lowered her baton and looked at Daniel for a long moment. The orchestra members waited, instruments ready. "Right. Well," she said finally, "I think we're going to be just fine." The relief Daniel felt was overwhelming. Several orchestra members smiled at him. The principal violinist gave him a thumbs up. They rehearsed 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each session got better, the coordination tighter, the musical conversation between Daniel and the orchestra more natural. Maestro Chen pushed him hard, making him repeat sections, asking for different interpretations, challenging him to think deeper about the music. Beethoven wrote this concerto when he was struggling with his hearing loss, she explained during one break. There's joy in this piece, yes, but there's also defiance. A refusal to let circumstances define him. I think you understand that better than most people. 3 days before the concert, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his dorm room bed, staring at the ceiling while Chris snored softly across the room. The reality was finally hitting him. In 72 hours, he'd be standing on the stage at Carnegie Hall, one of the most famous concert venues in the world. The performance would be broadcast live. His life, his story, his message would reach millions of people. What if he messed up? What if his nerves got the better of him? What if he let everyone down? His phone buzzed with a text message. It was Helen, even though it was 2 a.m. Can't sleep either. Want some tea? 20 minutes later, Daniel was sitting in Helen's kitchen while Robert puttered around making chamomile tea for all of them. I'm scared, Daniel admitted. What if I'm not ready? Helen wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at him thoughtfully. Do you remember what you felt like that night in the rain? When you were standing outside Romano's? Daniel nodded. You were desperate and hungry and humiliated. You had every reason to give up, to walk away, to decide the world was too cruel and your dreams didn't matter. But you didn't. You stood in that plaza and you played like your life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. That's still who you are, Daniel. That same person with that same fire. The only difference now is that you have support, training, and a platform. But the heart of it, the reason you play, that hasn't changed. What if I make mistakes? Daniel asked. Then you'll make mistakes, Helen said simply. Every musician makes mistakes. What matters is how you recover, how you keep going. And besides, the people coming to hear you aren't expecting perfection. They're coming because your story moved them. They want to witness your journey, to be part of this moment. You've already won their hearts. Robert set down fresh cookies he'd apparently baked earlier that evening, because of course he had. You know what I think? He said, settling into a chair. I think you're going to walk out on that stage, and you're going to see all those people who believe in you. And then you're going to play, and it's going to be beautiful, Becca. You're going to remember why you started this journey in the first place. Daniel ate a cookie and let their words sink in. They were right. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about honoring the gift he'd been given, sharing it with others, and hopefully inspiring kids like Tyler and Keisha and Raj to believe their dreams were possible too. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations, packing and travel arrangements. The foundation had arranged for several of the young people they were helping to attend the concert, flying them to New York and putting them up in a hotel. Daniel's story was going to be shown on screens throughout Carnegie Hall before the performance, reminding everyone where this journey had started. The night before the concert, Daniel sat alone in his hotel room and wrote a letter to his parents, something he did sometimes when he needed to feel close to them. I wish you could be here tomorrow, he wrote, but in a way, I know you will be. Every note I play is because of the love you gave me, the support you provided, the belief you had in my potential. I'm going to make you proud. I promise. He sealed the letter in an envelope, tucked it into his violin case, and finally fell asleep the morning of the concert. Daniel woke up at 5 a.m, even though he didn't need to be at Carnegie Hall until noon. He lay in bed watching the sky slowly lighten outside his hotel window, listening to the early morning sounds of New York City waking up. This was it. Everything had been leading to this moment. He got up and went through his usual warm-up routine, playing scales and exercises on his violin as quietly as possible so he wouldn't disturb other hotel guests. His hands felt steady, which surprised him. he'd expected to be shaking with nerves. But instead, there was a strange sense of calm settling over him. Helen knocked on his door at 8, bringing breakfast. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting down a tray with toast, fruit, and orange juice. "Okay, I think," Daniel said. "Is that weird? Shouldn't I be more nervous?" Helen smiled. Everyone handles big moments differently. Some people get anxious. Some people get calm. There's no right or wrong way to feel. Your body is just preparing itself in its own way. They ate breakfast together quietly, not talking much. Sometimes silence was better than trying to fill space with empty words at 11. They headed to Carnegie Hall, walking up to that iconic building. Seeing his name on the marquee alongside the orchestra's, Daniel had to stop and just stare for a moment. 6 months ago, he'd been sleeping under bridges. Now his name was on the front of Carnegie Hall. "Take a picture," Helen said gently. "You'll want to remember this." Inside, the backstage area was bustling with activity. Orchestra members were warming up, stage managers were checking sound equipment, and assistants were hurrying back and forth with clipboards and headsets. Maestro Chen found Daniel immediately and put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember what we worked on," she said. "Trust yourself, trust the orchestra, and let the music speak. Everything else will fall into place." In his dressing room, Daniel changed into the tuxedo that had been specially tailored for him. Looking at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. He looked older somehow, more confident. The scared kid who'd begged for food outside, Romanos felt like a different person from a different lifetime. There was a knock at the door. "You have some visitors," a stage manager said. Daniel opened the door to find Tyler, Keisha, and Raj standing there, along with about 8 other young people from the foundation. They were all dressed up for the concert, their faces glowing with excitement. "We just wanted to say good luck," Keisha said, "and thank you for everything." Tyler stepped forward and handed Daniel a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this for you. For today, you don't have to read it now if you don't want to." Daniel unfolded the paper. It was a poem, handwritten in Tyler's careful script. The title was Second Strings, and it was about second chances. About music that comes from broken places. About how the most beautiful sounds sometimes come from the most unexpected instruments. "This is beautiful," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, all of you." "We'll be cheering for you," Raj said. "Well, maybe not cheering. Is it okay to cheer at a classical concert? We'll be politely enthusiastic." Everyone laughed, and the tension Daniel had been holding in his chest loosened a little bit at 2 in the afternoon. The house lights dimmed and the audience settled into their seats. All 2,800 seats were filled. Helen and Robert were in the front row. Vincent from Romanos was there with his son, who he'd recently reconnected with. The foundation board members were scattered throughout the audience. News cameras were positioned at the back of the hall, ready to broadcast the performance live. The screens throughout the hall lit up with Daniel's story. Images of that rainy night outside Romanos, the viral video, clips from news interviews. They showed the work the foundation was doing, the young people it was helping. By the time the video ended, many people in the audience were wiping their eyes. Then the orchestra walked out on stage, followed by Maestro Chen. The applause was warm and welcoming. Finally, it was Daniel's turn. He walked out from the wings, his violin in one hand, and the sound that greeted him was like a physical force. The entire audience rose to their feet, applauding before he'd played a single note. The ovation went on, and Daniel stood there, feeling overwhelmed by the generosity of it, by the support of all these strangers who'd somehow become invested in his journey. When the applause finally died down and everyone returned to their seats, he looked at Maestro Chen, who gave him an encouraging nod. He looked out at the audience and found Helen's face in the crowd. She was smiling, her hands clasped together. Maestro Chen raised her baton. The orchestra lifted their instruments. And then, in that moment of perfect silence before the music began, Daniel closed his eyes and thought about his parents, about his grandmother, about every person who'd believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself. The orchestra began the opening tutti. Rich and powerful, Daniel listened, counting measures, waiting for his entrance. And when it came, he raised his violin and began to play. The first notes were soft, it's almost tentative, exactly as Beethoven had written them. But as the melody developed, Daniel's confidence grew. His fingers moved across the fingerboard with precision. His bow drew out sounds that were sometimes powerful, sometimes delicate. Always exactly what the music demanded. Playing with the orchestra felt like being part of a conversation. A give and take between his solo voice and the collective voice of dozens of musicians. When he played a phrase, the orchestra answered. When they built to a crescendo, he soared above them. It was magical in a way that practicing alone had never been. The first movement ended with a flourish, and the audience burst into applause, even though concert etiquette usually meant waiting until the end of the entire piece. Maestro Chen smiled and waited for the applause to fade before beginning the second movement. This movement was slower, more lyrical. It gave Daniel a chance to show not just his technical skill, but his ability to create beauty. To make the violin sing with a voice that was almost human. He thought about all the lonely nights, all the times he'd felt invisible, and he poured those feelings into the music. But he also thought about Helen's kindness, about the Foundation's work, about the second chances that had saved his life, and that hope flowed through his playing too. By the third movement, Daniel was completely lost in the music. His nervousness was gone, replaced by pure joy. This was why he played. Not for the applause or the recognition, but for this feeling of connection, of communication that went beyond words. The final movement was fast and technically demanding, full of rapid passages and tricky rhythms. Daniel's fingers flew across the strings, and the orchestra matched his energy. Building together toward the triumphant ending, the final chord rang out through Carnegie Hall. And for one perfect moment, there was absolute silence. Then the audience exploded. People leaped to their feet, cheering and applauding with an intensity that shook the walls. Daniel lowered his violin, breathing hard, and looked out at the sea of standing people. Many were crying. Some were holding up signs. All of them were celebrating not just a performance, but a journey. A story of resilience and hope. Maestro Chen was applauding too, gesturing for Daniel to take a bow. He did, then gestured to the orchestra, making sure they received recognition for their part in creating this moment. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Encore. Someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by others throughout the hall. Daniel looked at Maestro Chen, who nodded. They hadn't planned an encore, but how could he refuse? He thought for a moment about what to play, then decided on the piece that had started everything. The Paganini Caprice he'd played in the rain that night. This time, though, he played it differently. There was still emotion, still technical brilliance. But there was also gratitude, joy, a celebration of how far he'd come and how many people had helped him get here. When he finished, the audience's response was even more overwhelming than before. After the concert, Daniel was surrounded by people backstage. Musicians wanting to congratulate him, reporters asking for comments, Foundation supporters expressing their pride. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, but the moment that mattered most came when he found Tyler, Keisha, Raj, and the other Foundation kids waiting for him. They hugged him, all of them talking at once about how incredible the performance had been. "You showed them," Tyler said, his eyes bright. "You showed everyone that we matter. That our dreams matter?" Young girl Daniel hadn't met before stepped forward shyly. She looked about 14 with long dark hair and nervous eyes. "I saw your video 6 months ago," she said quietly. "I was in a group home and I paint, but everyone said it was stupid. After I saw what happened to you, I kept painting anyway. The Foundation found me last month. I start at school in the fall." Daniel knelt down, so he was at her eye level. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered. "Lily, I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll never stop painting. Not because of me, but because you have something inside you that needs to come out. The world needs your art. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Lily nodded, tears streaming down her face, and hugged him. That night, lying in his hotel bed, Daniel watched news coverage of the concert on his phone. The reviews were incredible. calling it one of the most moving performances Carnegie Hall had seen in years. But what struck him most were the comments from regular people sharing their own stories of being underestimated, of having their talents dismissed, of fighting to be seen. His phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "I'm so proud of you. Not just for tonight's performance, but for who you've become. Your parents would be too." Daniel smiled and typed back, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing when I'd almost stopped believing in myself." 3 months later, Daniel was back at the university, balancing his studies with foundation work and occasional performances. The foundation had grown to help over 50 young people, with plans to expand to other cities. Romano's restaurant had become a weekly venue for young musicians, just as Vincent had promised. And Gerald's replacement made sure. Every performer was treated with dignity and respect. Daniel still carried his violin in the same beat-up case. Even though people had offered to buy him a new one, that case had been with him through everything, and he wasn't ready to let it go. Besides, it reminded him of where he'd come from. Not to dwell on the pain, but to remember that circumstances don't define potential. One evening, walking through campus, Daniel passed a young man sitting on a bench holding a guitar case. The kid looked lost, his clothes worn, his expression defeated. Daniel recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once. He stopped and sat down next to the young man. "Do you play?" Daniel asked, nodding at the guitar case. The kid looked at him suspiciously. "Yeah, why?" "I'd like to hear if you're willing to play." "Not very good," the kid said automatically. Daniel smiled. "I used to say the same thing. How about you let me be the judge of that?" The young man hesitated, then opened his case and began to play. And Daniel listened, really listened, the way Helen had listened to him that rainy night, because that's what the world needed more of. People willing to listen, to see beyond appearances, to give others the chance they deserved. And the music played on.